inviting me here, I have to say. As a foreigner, I still think of myself as a foreigner. It's really exciting to see what Sarah Palin would call the real America, right? The stuff you don't get on TV, although someone can tell me famous films or TV that's set in Lincoln, Nebraska. I don't know, but it's like really existentially interesting. So the title, what would you do and who would you kill to save the end of the world? It has a minor and a major meaning. The minor meaning is predominantly post-apocalyptic cinema is about vanquishing some enemy in order to save the world, whether it's aliens or the tornado or the virus, right? You have to kill something in order to save humanity. So that looks like it's a disaster film trope. But what I want to argue is that's a question, who would you kill in order to save the world? What would you do and who would you kill in order to save the world? Is a question we don't ask ourselves every day, but we should be asking ourselves every day. So the very fact that I'm standing here tonight in these lovely surroundings required the death of many humans. I mean, America's built on slavery for a start, but that's not where it ends, right? And every decision we make every day produces 1,000 deaths at least elsewhere on the globe. And we make that decision, more or less. I mean, we don't decide it. So that's where it comes from. So what I'm going to talk, I do have a written talk, but I tend to sort of jabber around it, but it will have 4 or 5 sections depending on time. First section is what is the politics of extinction. The second section is what is unthinkable. And then the third section is what would you do and who would you kill in order to save the world. So there's a preamble before I get to that. And then some other stuff, but it depends. So here's the beginning on the politics of extinction. And I'm going to refer to a film, I'm not sure whether many of you or all of you have seen it, but it's Cormac McCarthy's The Counsellor from 2013. And generally the plot is very Cormac McCarthy, but it's a very standard plot where the counsellor, who's a lawyer, makes one bad drug deal and then ends up with Mexican drug cartels and moves from civilization to barbarism. So that's the classic Cormac McCarthy narrative where you're always one bad drug deal away from the end of the world. And the end of the world is Mexico, right, where law doesn't apply and someone's always about to decapitate you, right? Even though it's a cliche, it's something that isn't it isn't unique to Cormac McCarthy, obviously, that the end of the world is Africa or the end of the world is Mexico, right? So that goes back to Conrad's Heart of Darkness and so on. So the 2 scenes I want to at least think about. The beginning of the film, Cameron Diaz, who's dressed in leopard print, watches, like while having a cocktail, 2 animals, wild cats, destroy each other, like tear themselves, you know, like one eats the other. And she just has an evening aperitif while watching this happen. This is what I, as an English literature person, was trained to diagnose as depoliticisation, right? It's the way of the world is just violence and nature is red in tooth and claw. And what we think of as civilization is really just a mask or a veneer that covers over a natural or default barbarism. It's an idea that goes back to Hobbes and state of nature. You know, all you've got to do is remove the thin fabric of civilization and we're all destroying each other. So that seems to be like the classic depoliticising motif and the classic English department, feminist, Marxist criticism is to intervene and say what you think of as, you know, the human condition, we're one step away from barbarism, is really political, economic, racial and sexual, right? So that's the normal way of diagnosing these things. What I want to do in thinking about the politics politics of extinction is say that what makes a film like Cormac McCarthy's interesting in the 21st century is that the usual response we have to those depoliticising moments in film where life is just inhumane and violent and we're all one step away from barbarism, Lord of the Flies, Conrad's Heart of Darkness for Cormac McCarthy's Counsellor. What I want to suggest is that we think differently about that in the 21st century, and for this reason. The political climate, and I'm using the word political climate in two senses. Okay, one is the political climate in which we should question the extent to which we want to attribute things like violence, barbarism, bloodthirstiness, ruthlessness, dehumanisation to some moment of pre-state, pre-civilizational behaviour. So what has become, I think, obvious in the 21st century is that it's the state, right, and civility that is like the two animals tearing themselves apart, right? So that in the Cormac McCarthy world where Mexico is the end of the world, that's where you get drug cartels and people that will decapitate you if you look at them in a funny way. That ruthlessness is actually the state, right? And we look to what McCarthy sees as the end of the world, Mexico. I mean, Mexico is Mexico. It's like a fictional planet in Cormac McCarthy. You always head into Mexico and the thin veneer of civilization falls away. That actually what might be the beginnings of another world is Mexico, if that makes any sense. So instead of seeing what Conrad depicted in Heart of Darkness as Africa as a figure of the end of the world, what the 21st century is forcing us to think about is that what has always called itself the world is actually the end of the world. And what looks like the end of the world is the possible new world. So if you think of Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Belgium, not that I want to offend any Belgians in the audience, but like the high civility, because the odds of a Belgian being in the audience is so high, but the centre of civility is really the centre of barbarism, and what one is trying to avoid, the end of the world is really a possible new world. So what I want to do in thinking about the politics of extinction is think about what I said is looking at our political climate and the way our political climate exists within a broader milieu of climate in the meteorological sense. And what we can see is it's true in a classic Hobbesian sense that what we think of as the polity does protect us from the world out there, right? The fact that you're in Washington and you're debating impeachment does protect you from the climate, but that's not civility, that's the end of the world, right? So the end of the world is actually probably, not that I'd like to point out I'm not a Trump supporter who thinks that impeachment is necessarily a bad thing, although I do think it's sort of a disaster, right, that we think that that's where our political energies should lie, when really that's the catastrophe, is that that scale of the political. So the first thing I want to do, what is the politics of extinction? Short answer, politics of extinction imposes itself upon us to think of what we think of the end of the world, Cormac McCarthy's Mexico, is actually not the end of the world. Right? And that holding on to the world, holding on to Washington, D.C. as opposed to Mexico, is probably the end of the world. So saving the world is the end of the world. That makes any sense. Okay, so that's the preamble. So now the second section is what is unthinkable. So one might think of unthinkability as a way of comparing different environments, so that we might briefly conclude that given our current desires, habits, expectations, and bodily composition, we struggle to imagine what the statistics on climate change appear to be telling us will happen. So what I'm thinking of is a very concrete unthinkability. I took an aeroplane here to do this. In a sense, that's absolutely crazy, and Roland's got kids, and he invited me to do this, right? In a sense, that's just the most, that just shows how unthinkable what's really happening is. I mean, I'm still doing it, we're all still here in a lighted auditorium. The consequences of what we're doing right now are catastrophic. But it's really hard. I find, well, obviously I find it hard to assimilate because I'm still here, right? I'm not in a state of panic. I'm not trying to mobilise